views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
Hello and welcome to Open BXRx, BronxNet special coverage providing you the latest information, resources, services, community efforts taking place locally here in the Bronx and virtually throughout the pandemic. I'm your host, Sonyi Lopez, and today is Tuesday, October 13th. Coming up, first we'll focus on voting and voter engagement on social media through Everyday Bronx's new photography project called #Bronx Votes. Then we'll discuss what voter suppression looks like this election season with City NY reporter Josefa Velasquez. After that, we'll shift gears towards environmental justice in the Bronx when City NY reporter Olumhense joins us to share more about the relationship between air quality and COVID-19. And Generation Green shares what environmental racism is and why we should rethink the statement, "The Bronx is dirty." Stay tuned. Open BXRX starts now. Welcome to Open BXRX on BronxNet. I'm your host, Sonyi Lopez, inviting you to get social with us at BronxNet TV on Instagram and Twitter, and BronxNet Community Television on Facebook. When was the last time you voted? Why are you voting in this election? What are the issues that most concern the Bronx? And why should Bronxites vote? These are all questions that Everyday Bronx wants you to answer through their latest project, #Bronx Votes, encouraging you to make your voice heard this election season. Joining us now to share more about this project and invite you to participate is Rhynna M. Santos. She is the curator at Everyday Bronx. Welcome, Rhynna. Thank you so much for joining us today.
It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you so much.
Of course. For those who are not familiar, please give us a little bit of background on Everyday Project and Everyday Bronx.
So Everyday Projects originated with Everyday Africa, which was started by journalists and photographers Austin Merrill and Peter DeCampo. They started the Instagram account to challenge the stereotypes commonly seen in media about Africa, and they used documentary photography to show a more realistic depiction of the everyday life in Africa. The account became incredibly popular and inspirational, and other photographers started accounts to fight stereotypes about where they lived. And through the years, it has evolved to a global community of photographers that try to convey a more accurate view of daily life around the world. Now there are over 60 official everyday accounts and counting. Everyday Bronx started the summer of 2014. I got the feed in October of that year. And when I got the account, it only had 1,007 followers. But today we have 39,700 followers. We're only 300 followers away from 40,000. And this project is really important to me because it allows us to help weave a more accurate story of the real Bronx through documentary style photos. Historically, as you know, the Bronx has been plagued with incredibly negative stereotypes. Everyday Bronx attempts to fight those destructive representations with a more accurate view of the beauty and strength of the people who live here. And I call what we do corrective storytelling. The unique thing about our feed is that compared to other Everyday Project feeds, our content is made up 100% by our followers. So basically, Bronxites are telling their own story by using the #EverydayBronx.
And it's an authentic story, because we live here and that shares the authentic stories of everyone living in the community. So I love that, that sets the Everyday Bronx page apart from every other page. And it's so unique and encouraging to see Bronxites participate in these photo projects through Everyday Bronx. You just told me, Rhynna, who is behind the Everyday Bronx page. Who are the photographers also that go around the Bronx to photograph different communities?
I work with an amazing group of talented photographers and Bronxites, and the Everyday Bronx team is made up of 5 people. I myself am the director, but we also have photographer Edgar Santana, Cynthia Chiconi, Heriberto Sanchez, and our latest addition to the team, Kayla Beltran.
Wonderful. I think I know some of those names too. I'm familiar with some of the photographers behind the page, and I always see them post about it on their own pages as well. I love the page, and I think everyone should check it out. Before we continue, please follow Everyday Bronx on social media at Everyday Bronx to check out what we're discussing right now. Rhynna, can you tell us about how Everyday Bronx is encouraging Bronxites to vote through the hashtag Bronx Votes project? What is it, and how can people participate this election season?
Excellent question. So basically, recognizing the power of social media, we wanted to show empowered Bronxites taking part in this election and to encourage others to vote, especially young people and first-time voters. We want to show Bronxites how easy it is to vote and what voting means in this historic election. We want to move people to act because it is in their own best interest to vote and get involved in what happens in their community. And the project is only a week and a half old, and we've already produced the highest liked image of Everyday Bronx history. So people are really engaging with Bronx Vote.
Rhynna, can you share which image that was, and also tell us about another hashtag Bronx Vote submission so far and what these posts represent?
So there are two photos that I really think about that have really been highlighted during Bronx Vote. And the first one is by a Bronx, Everyday Bronx member, which is Cynthia Chiconi. She is a teacher and a photographer as well. And she took a photo of herself in front of the school where she teaches. And basically, you know, she wrote that she is voting this year because she wants to be a positive example for her students. Basically, you know, she doesn't want to say, she wants to do, and to show by example and to give that kind of representation for young adults. And, you know, the photo really resonated. You know, as an essential worker, she is putting her life on the line every day, teaching Bronx kids, educating them. And so I think people really responded to her photo. And the second photo that really has resonated with our followers is by photographer and nurse Sandra Ayala. Her image is of her house. And she put up these three flags. She put up a Black Lives Matter flag, a Puerto Rican black and white resistance flag, and a F Trump 2020 flag. Her family really wanted to respond to the large amount of Trump flags that are being put up all around Throgs Neck. And the thing is that it hadn't been even 24 hours since she put up the flags, where in community Facebook groups, she and her family were being called trash. And the local news actually came to her home and was asking her how she felt about her neighbors being so furious about her flags. And so this photo, as of last night, has gotten 2,824 likes and 188 comments, the most we've ever had on the feed for any one photo. And you can really tell how people are really engaging with this year's election, how important it is, and, you know, how people get to express, you know, their own beliefs. She's actually been threatened, you know, and intimidated by her neighbors. So this is an incredibly important issue.
Right. And right now the page opens that discussion, you know, with the state of the borough, the state of our borough here in the Bronx, and how politics are kind of divided within our borough in and of itself. And, you know, with that being said, can you please remind us, Rhynna, of what this election truly means to the Bronx and how we can all collectively engage and increase voter literacy, voter registration, and voter turnout cross-generationally here in the Bronx?
Well, in this historic election, a lot is at stake, not just for Bronxites and New Yorkers, but for our entire country. Issues like COVID-19 impact, immigration, healthcare, employment, and criminal justice reform are all on the table. That is why understanding the voting process is important, so you can participate and have a say on how you're represented in your community and in your country. So we're posting voting information daily on our Instagram stories so people know what to do to vote. I don't know if you know this, but Bronx voter registration has dropped 59% from 2016. And we especially want to encourage young people to register to vote. Over 400,000 young people in New York City are not registered, and their concerns and needs need to be counted too. And also, we all know people that because of one reason or another can't vote here. For example, Puerto Ricans who live on the island can vote. So when you cast your ballot, know that you're voting for all of those who can't vote. Let their voices be heard too. And more importantly, let's also remember early voting starts October 24th and election day is Tuesday, November 3rd.
All very important dates. Thank you, Rhynna, for sharing with our viewers. Before we go, I wanted to ask you how viewers can follow Everyday Bronx and also participate in the Bronx Votes project. But before that, I actually wanted to ask you the impact that social media has on this election, right? Because Everyday Bronx is using social media in order to post these images and get people engaged. Just tell us about the impact of the digital space, the digital realm during the election season.
So much is happening online, digitally, and we know that that is where most of us are really communicating, especially now during this world pandemic where we have to practice social distancing. And so a lot of these communications are happening online and people are engaging. And especially, I really do see a lot of young people being more politically minded now because, as we can see, young people have lost so much because of this pandemic. High school graduations, first years in college, a lot of their families have been affected so much. And so it's important to use all of these situations and experiences and trying to really be able to put that energy into something positive, like voting, like being able to use your power to really shape your community and to really shape your future. And so I think that social media is an incredible tool. Everyday Bronx, I love the Everyday projects because it is about equity. Everyday Bronx is about photos on your telephone. And most people have a telephone. And I think it's important that, people should express themselves artistically, not just people that have super expensive cameras, but everybody, all of us. And I love that about the Everyday projects because you can take a photo of anything that moves you and be able to post it on Instagram and to be able to have a say in, like, this is how I look at my surroundings today. This is the kind of everyday experience that I have, which is very different than the everyday experience that is talked about when it comes to the Bronx. So I love social media, and I think we should really lean into what we have available at our fingertips instead of keep saying and thinking about what we don't have right now. Let's think about what we do have and how lucky we have to have it and to be able to continue to converse and encourage each other.
Absolutely. Thank you, Rhynna, for that. Let's invite our viewers to participate in the hashtag Bronx Vote project and vote in this election.
I would love for you to follow Everyday Bronx on Instagram. We are only 300 followers away from 40,000, which would be huge for us. We want to feature you. So please use the hashtag Bronx Vote to share your photos and tell us what you're voting in this election. And let's make our voices be heard.
Thank you, Rhynna. Folks, you heard it here. You can follow at Everyday Bronx on social media, participate in their hashtag Bronx Vote project. Take those photos of what voting looks like to you this election season here in the Bronx and share your story. Let your voice be heard this election season. We'll be right back.
Sounds from a rally a few months ago calling for justice for Alan Feliz, a Bronx man who was shot by Sergeant Jonathan Rivera during a traffic stop on October 17th.
We were completely devastated, honestly.
The feelings of the brother of Alan Feliz, Sammy, and his family 3 months after the protest and 11 months after the death of his brother following Attorney General Letitia James' decision not to file charges against the officers involved in Feliz's death.
Our initial reaction was that the information that was provided to them for their investigation was so clear that the decision wasn't going to be a difficult one.
The Attorney General's office released a statement on their findings, saying in part, based on the witness accounts, considerable video evidence, and an exhaustive review of the facts, the use of deadly force could not be proven to be unjustified beyond a reasonable doubt, as the legal standard requires.
Put it in park! Put it in park! Put it in park! Yo! Should I call an 85? Should I call? Put it in park! Put it in park, Eddie. If I have to end up shooting you, bro.
The final moments leading up to Feliz's death, documented by police body camera footage.
Oh my God! Sarge!
In the same statement announcing the decision not to charge the officers, the Attorney General also admits to finding several serious concerns with the way the NYPD handled the situation and issued a recommendation to remove NYPD officers from engaging in routine traffic stops altogether.
At this point in time, our current course of action is we're demanding for the Mayor Bill de Blasio and also Commissioner O'Shea to fire these officers.
Feliz's family came together to express their outrage at the Attorney General's decision, saying in part, "We do not accept this outcome and will continue to fight for justice and change for Alan. We will not remain silent as our families and community members are unnecessarily and unjustly taken from us."
And it's so eerie to have that feeling that I can cross paths with my brother's killer and not know what determination what I would have with an encounter with him, how he would approach that situation.
Reporting for BronxNet, Jericho Tran.
Welcome back. As we prepare for the fast approaching 2020 general elections, there are some concerns of voter suppression and inequities exacerbated by the pandemic. What should we look out for here in the Bronx during election season? Joining us now to share more about voting and voter suppression is Josefa Velasquez. She is a senior reporter at the city. Josefa, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. So first, can you just tell us about yourself and your work over at the city?
Yeah, so like you mentioned, I'm a senior reporter at the city, which is a nonprofit news website. We launched in April of 2019, and I have the distinction of being the one that covers sort of politics and policy for New York State. So that just means, not just the things that are happening in the city, but also things that are happening at the state capitol in Albany and how that affects everyone here in New York City.
Thank you, Josefa. And just to start with the definition, what is voter suppression for our viewers who may not be familiar with the term?
Yeah, so voter suppression is just a fancy way of saying one group does not want another group to vote. So what voter suppression means is that one group, whether it's Democrats, Republicans, one ethnic group, is trying to make it really difficult for another group to vote. So when you see that word, just think about they're trying to make it harder for you to vote. That's it.
And are certain communities more susceptible to voter suppression? What types of suppression are Bronxites and communities of color and elderly more likely to face?
Yeah, so the interesting thing about voter suppression is that everyone does it. Republicans do it to Democrats, Democrats do it to Republicans, Republicans do it to Republicans, Democrats do it to Democrats. In the Bronx, it's interesting because it's a really blue area. So you have a lot of Democrats, but that doesn't mean that voter suppression doesn't happen up there. You have different politicians who are doing it to other politicians or other elected officials. And in the Bronx particularly, you can have sort of, the new wave of Democrats, so the more liberal, progressive Democrats, doing it to more traditional, sort of mainline, middle of the road Democrats. And similarly, for elderly populations, voter suppression, that's the interesting thing about voter suppression, that it could look so different to so many people. But for elderly communities, it could mean, it's more difficult for you to go out and cast your vote in this upcoming election. So now that we have, this whole pandemic going on, the state's been trying to make it easier for people to vote by mail or to cast their votes early. So in a way, trying to force people to vote only on election day could be seen as a form of voter suppression because people are scared about their health and well-being with COVID-19 out there.
Absolutely. And in a recent presentation, you actually brought up some of the issues in the June 2020 elections. Are we susceptible to seeing these same issues resurface again in the general elections?
Yeah, so it's funny that you bring that up. Right after I gave that presentation, everything sort of blew up in Brooklyn, where you had people who got an absentee ballot have a different address on their return envelope. And that is a form of voter suppression because it's making it difficult for people to just get their ballot, write it down, mark it back in, because now you just have someone else's address on there, someone else's information, and the state is trying to figure out okay, well, how do we fix this? And how do we fix this quickly? But during the June primary, there were issues where people would go to the ballot box, people would go to their polling site, and they didn't get the full ballot. They either got one page of it or the other page, but not the whole thing together. There were also issues of people requesting absentee ballots and never getting them. So we learned from that experience and are trying to make it better, but like, we're a month away now? Who knows what's gonna happen between now and then.
Josefa, I recently read that Texas Governor Greg Abbott limited counties to only one location for collecting completed mail ballots as a way to enhance, quote, ballot security protocol, end quote. Can this be deemed as suppression? And are we at risk of encountering these issues here in the Bronx during COVID-19?
Yeah, so that's definitely considered suppression, I would argue, especially because if you have, let's say, one polling place per county, that means that every single person who wants to vote has to go to that one spot. Now, imagine that now with the pandemic where people have been told, like, don't do mass gatherings, stay 6 feet away from each other. If you have asthma, which, the Bronx has high rates of asthma, and that makes you more susceptible of getting really sick from this virus, do you really want to risk your health to go cast your ballot? Maybe not. If you're older, and you have maybe some other chronic health conditions, or even if you're perfectly healthy, do you really want to risk your health and safety and risk the health and safety of your family to go cast your ballot? That's probably not a risk you're willing to take. I think the New York City Board of Elections is supposed to come up with their plan for early voting and trying to come up with like areas to drop off your ballot so you don't have to wait online the day of. But it's likely that we might see that happening on election day, where you have these really long lines and people just saying, I'm not going to try to put my health at risk for something like this. Like, the Bronx is blue anyway, and New York goes blue anyway, so why does it matter? But it does matter.
Right. I'm sure that's a sentiment for a lot of folks in the Bronx as well. And early voting is only a few weeks away. If that plan is not under surge yet, imagine, we're all going to be confused yet again during voting season. Josefa, does voter suppression exist online in the digital realm? If so, what does it look like online?
Yeah, so it absolutely exists online. And like I said, it could look completely different. So it could all start out with, one person posting on Facebook, or like in the WhatsApp group between you and your family, or like your neighbor saying, hey, I heard that, this polling place is closed. It's just basically voter suppression could just be a rumor that someone hears about that isn't like verified, and it starts spreading. That's something along the lines of, well, I heard this polling place is closed. I heard the post office is not delivering or throwing out certain people's ballots. And that just is the match that ignites the fire, and it spreads. I mean, nothing spreads faster than like a rumor on WhatsApp between like different families and different communities. So that's something to look out for. I mean, if you start seeing, your Facebook friends, your family members start saying, we heard this is happening, always try to question it unless it comes from like a good source, or, try to ask the question yourself, because the way things spread online is like a wildfire. So it's crazy, and it takes so many different forms and can look so different to different people. And it could be some tiny little thing that just then gets blown out of proportion.
That is so true. And just before we go, Josefa, how can people protect their votes this season?
Yeah, so what people are saying, elected officials are saying, is to vote, if you can, vote in person. New York is allowing people to vote early. So if it's possible and you can do it, vote early and in person. If you can't do that, then don't wait until the last minute to mail in your ballot. That's what the post office has sort of been, really, really sounding the alarms over, is send in your vote as soon as possible. The last thing you want is for it to get stamped on the day after and your vote doesn't count. Make sure that if you're going to vote through a mail-in ballot, do it as soon as possible. If you're going to vote early, do it as soon as possible, because the last thing you should do is be able to vote in person the day of. Like, that's for the people that can't, didn't plan well enough or don't have other time to do it. But, at least you have this like runway of time to be able to cast your vote before, the big day.
Absolutely. Great advice. Thank you so much. I read somewhere that over 500,000 ballots were rejected and discarded due to human error in the primary elections. That's things like not filling in the bubbles and marking X's and check marks instead, or forgetting to sign the back of the ballot, the absentee ballot actually, and dating it as well. Some people as well, like Josefa just mentioned, actually submitted it after the deadline at the time. So we have to ensure that we submit our ballots before the deadline. That's November 3rd, this election season. And if you are dropping it off in person at an early voting poll site, you have between October 24th and November 1st to do that at a poll site in person, and November 3rd by 9 p.m. or at the Bronx County Board of Elections here in the Bronx, no later than November 3rd by 9 p.m. If you miss any of those guidelines, your ballot is subject to be discarded, and that can be some type of voter suppression. No, Josefa?
Yeah, and the thing to also consider is that while yes, New York usually does tend to go blue in the presidential election, we're not just voting for president here. There are so many other things down the ballot line, and your local elected official, whether that's your congressperson, your state senator, your state assembly member, those are all people who you probably interact with most and who have more of an impact on your day-to-day life than say the president does. So, make sure to go down the line and, try to research, who's running in your area. Are you okay with what they're saying and the positions that they have? Because it's not just, president that we're looking out for, it's also the elected officials and that are local. And those races can be really, really close. We're talking like sometimes it's up to a dozen or 24 votes that determines who wins that race. So that's something to take into consideration. Your vote counts. It absolutely counts. Don't let anyone say otherwise, because in these local races, it could be up to 100 votes that determines the winner, even less than that.
That is so true. Thank you, Josefa Velasquez, senior reporter at The City, for joining us today and discussing this very important topic of voting and voter suppression. Thank you.
Thank you.
Folks, you can follow at J_Velasquez on Twitter and read her work as well on voter suppression and more at thecity.nyc. We'll be right back.
Hi, I'm Bronx Borough President Ruben Diaz Jr., and I'm making sure that the Bronx counts is my priority. That's why I'm urging everyone to fill out the 2020 census. The 2020 census is important because it would allow for the federal government to determine how much money and resources the Bronx is going to need for the next 10 years around healthcare, education, housing, roads, representation, and so many other things. What does it mean exactly? Just imagine. Imagine if you are organizing a party or an event and you send out 100 invitations, but only 50 people RSVP, and you only prepare for 50 people, and yet 100 people showed up. You're gonna be short of food, seats, tables, chairs. That's why it is important that 100% of us here in the Bronx fill out the 2020 census. It is easy, it is confidential, it doesn't matter whether you're a citizen or undocumented. We need everybody to fill it out. Now let's all get together and make the Bronx count.
We know that people are dealing with the health crisis, but there's also a lot of food insecurity.
We're giving out healthy food options, and that's what's key here.
If you're a senior, you have a disability, they'll actually deliver meals to you.
The residents are anxious, they're worried, they're scared, they want to be tested.
When things were happening in our community, and we couldn't get the help.
There's almost a presumption of criminality that attaches to your skin color.
The site will prioritize those who are at highest risk in the population.
If you feel symptoms and you'd like to visit one of these COVID-19 testing sites here in the Bronx, you may call the State Health Department's hotline.
Important to note about this site is no reservations are needed. This is a walk-in clinic.
A lot of us are out of work and looking for something to do.
We have the machinery and the skills to make large scales of these masks and gowns.
Take care of your people. It's going to go way further than we actually can understand.
Right now, employees like myself are just adjusting to the new reality.
Reporting from BronxNet, this is Trans.
A decade in the making, created in 1790 to allocate our U.S. population and economy. An every 10 years check-in determining our community residents and needs. Women Voices lead. Suffrage Centennial acknowledges another year of elections, while Women in the Heights artists celebrate their 10 years anniversary through Northern Manhattan Arts Alliance guidance to ensure Uptown is recorded through our census count is how we identify our community needs. Although we are living in a social distancing era, thanks to the worldwide internet, we now have the means to hear the popular voices. So don't be left out. Go to my2020census.gov and make sure to be counted.
Al tomar transporte público, no toques su teléfono. Lleve desinfectante para sus manos y úselo inmediatamente al salir del autobús o tren. No te toques la cara. Si alguien tose o estornuda, aléjase. Lávese las manos con agua y jabón lo antes posible. Limite el contacto con los postes. Si es posible, evite las horas pico. No comas ni bebas en transporte público. Mantenga su bolsa del piso o otras superficies. Evite tocar directamente los torniquetes. Manténgase al día con lo último de su Departamento de Salud local y el CDC.
Who's most at risk for coronavirus? People over 65, people with underlying medical conditions like heart disease, chronic lung disease, asthma, diabetes, people undergoing cancer treatment, and people with weakened immune systems. What should you do if you or a loved one is at higher risk? Avoid close contact with people. Avoid crowds. Stay home if you can. Wash your hands frequently. Learn more ways to protect yourself and others at coronavirus.gov.
Why should young people care about the spread of coronavirus? Well, we know that people with underlying medical conditions over the age of 60 are at highest risk, but they've got to get it from somebody.
So we're asking everyone to be selfless for others so that we can protect those who are most susceptible.
Not going to bars, not going to restaurants. It all just means physical separation so that you have a space between you and others.
For more information on how you can social distance, please go to coronavirus.gov.
Welcome back. For some Bronx residents, living near a highway has been a life-threatening situation, especially during COVID-19. Joining us now to share how air pollution may be linked to the risk of death from the coronavirus is S.A. Olumhense. S.A. is a reporter at the city. S.A., thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. First, before we start, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and the work you do at the city?
My name is S.A., as you said. I'm a reporter at the city where I cover the Bronx, which is where I'm from. I love writing stories that help people understand how systems in our lives fail us, how systems in our lives work, and how people participate and interact with some of these systems.
Thank you, S.A. And one of those systems is environmental justice here in the Bronx. You recently wrote a piece investigating how living near highways, particularly the Cross Bronx, may be linked to the risk of death from coronavirus. Can you please help us break down the relationship between air pollution and high COVID-19 deaths?
So mounting evidence is starting to suggest that poor air quality is linked to COVID-19 mortality. I was surprised to read in a study not very long ago that did a ranking and analysis of all of the counties in the United States. That's 100 and something of them. And it ranked the Bronx, these scientists in this peer-reviewed study, ranked the Bronx as #1 of all of these counties for COVID-19 death rate and for poor air quality. And they used an analysis of EPA, United States Environmental Protection Agency, data to get to that conclusion. And I was so surprised reading this because I was like, what is it about the Bronx that explains this #1 ranking on this list? Is it a particular site? Is it a particular, can we point to something that would inform people of why this is happening here? And all of this research that's coming out, I mean, it confirms something that people living in the community have known for a really long time, myself included, that sometimes where you are living affects the place or affects your health in the place that you are living. It's fascinating to see this with things like asthma or with things like diabetes. There are so many factors that influence our health that it surprises me each day to find out something new. So these studies are kind of making all of this clear, or kind of reinforcing what people have known for a really long time, but adding urgency because COVID-19 is happening. It's a pandemic that we're all living through right now.
Absolutely. And I say for those viewers who may not be familiar as to what environmental inequality looks like in the Bronx, does it look like factories around you? Is it car pollution? What are some of the factors that contribute to environmental inequality in our borough?
That's an excellent question. There are a mix of factors that contribute to poor health. When we think of the environment, you can think about things like living near a highway or siting near maybe like a sewage site, or living in a place where the quality of housing perhaps is more run down, or if there are other like lead, like all of these kind of physical factors that influence the way that we live are things that can distinguish a community from being a community where there is environmental justice or environmental injustice. And a lot of the Bronx, so many people know, lots of people are living near highways. They're living in places where they're exposed to a lot of truck traffic. They're living in places with these deteriorating housing conditions. There are a number of factors that inform our portrait of health, and a lot of these things have a lot more influence than even I knew or lots of other folks know.
Right. And you also open your story with Alicia Bure. Alicia is a mom who realized her son was less susceptible to an asthma attack at the beginning of the pandemic, when less cars were on the road, of course. Alicia also lost her mother-in-law to COVID-19. Ese, can you tell us about the Bronx families you've spoken to, like Alicia's family, and how their long-lived realities often fell on deaf ears, but are now coming to light through this pandemic?
Yeah, Alicia Bure is an amazing woman. Her strength and her resilience to get this obituary out of her grandmother-in-law, to speak up about some of these things and kind of raise awareness of it is amazing to me. I think, I mean, again, there's a line in the story where another person says, well, we all know someone with asthma. How many of us, the folks listening, the folks watching, know somebody with asthma who lives in the Bronx? I mean, there's so many people, myself included, you know, it's like, this is almost something that affects so many of us. And hearing from one parent who said, well, my child has asthma, or I developed asthma, or, I mean, there is almost no one that I know personally who is not touched by this in some way. And I think Bronx families are incredibly resilient. I mean, in Alicia's case, it took a pandemic for her to realize, for it to like fully become clear for her that the place that they were living in was influencing her son's health to such a degree. You know, to add just a little bit more information on her, she has 2 children. Her oldest son did not grow up as close to the Deegan and the Cross Bronx as her youngest son did. The older son does not have asthma. The younger son does. So, I mean, in that case, it's almost like an anecdote that makes really clear that this is such an important difference in people's lives.
Such a juxtaposition in the same family. No, one child asthma, the other no, and you can kind of relate to why this is. One lives where the highway is and the other doesn't. We also have something called Asthma Alley here in the Bronx. It's an invisible alley, but we know that this is where there's a lot of air pollution and, huge asthma rates as well as diabetes as well. Through COVID-19, I feel like a lot of people are also learning how our direct environment, not only, the air, but our environment, the lack of food, food justice, inequality, all of these things that impact us have been tied to the COVID-19 rates of death, and also just the rates of infection here in the Bronx as well. Ese, can you also tell us about the city's Missing Them database and how this piece came from researching that database on the city's website?
So Missing Them is one of the more amazing things that I've ever worked on as a journalist. This is an effort to document the lives of every single New Yorker who died from COVID-19. This is tens of thousands of people, and we're making our way kind of through every single person calling family members and friends, talking to people, getting these crowdsourced obituaries, talking to people in unions. I mean, the work and the stories that have come out of that are amazing. Something, you know, like Alicia mentioning her son's asthma, it may seem like a passing comment, but you think about it and it's like, so much of how people lived and how they died is important to the history of like the world, you know, because the United States is such a hotspot for COVID-19, and the Bronx at a point was the epicenter, and the epicenter that was New York City. I mean, it's amazing to be able to contribute something to this. It does not cost anything to have this obituary included. We know that cost is often a big factor in keeping folks who are from more diverse backgrounds. Most obituaries tend to be of white men, keeping them from accessing obituaries. So please, 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 if you are a person who has lost a family member, who has lost a friend from this virus, you can contact us by email, tips at the city or missing them at the city. You can text remember to 73224. You can email me, you can email us. Please help us document the lives of and honor the memory of the folks that we have lost from this virus.
And Essay, was this database born after you wrote this other article at the city? It's titled Bronx Residents Twice as Likely to Die from COVID-19. Was this born after the database?
That's an independent, Missing Them is an independent project that is using different sources to build out this data, including crowdsourcing. But the story that I wrote that you referenced is from a separate bit of reporting.
Gotcha. And before we go, we want to also discuss that. I remember I saw that headline and it kind of impacted me. Bronx residents twice as likely to die from COVID-19. And immediately I was just like, why? Why is this happening in the Bronx? You know, and I'm glad that the database is created now so we can finally put names and faces to these numbers that were coming out in the beginning of the pandemic. But just a little bit about that piece as well and why it's important to highlight the issues here in the Bronx that contribute to the high rates of COVID-19.
Yeah, I mean, it breaks my heart on a personal level to, like, I have struggled with am I going to write another negative story about how the Bronx is being affected by COVID? I want people to know more than anything how we are uniquely vulnerable in some ways to contracting the virus and to folks dying from this virus. The reason I take air quality so seriously and the reason I wanted to write about it so much was, I mean, one is personal. So growing up in the Northeast Bronx, my dad always tells the story of coming into the nursery one day and I was like struggling to breathe. And he was like, what's going on? And he takes me to the hospital. They thought I was having an asthma attack. My parents are Nigerian. They immigrated to the Bronx. Neither of them had anyone in their family who had asthma. That was not a thing that they knew very much about. I get a little older. My parents moved to the suburbs. My asthma in 1 or 2 years is so much less severe that I don't need to take daily medication. And since that time, I've never needed it again. And that was one of the examples for me that really solidified, like, where you live matters, like what you are exposed to matters. And it's so much more urgent with COVID and air quality, you know, to offer the second reason. If you don't want to live near a toxic waste site, a lot of us in a lot of cases can choose not to do that. If you know that your water supply is contaminated in some way, so many of us can buy bottled water. But air, we're breathing it in every day. Like, you can't just say, oh, let me like close my lungs off while I get to a different location with better air quality. It's been life and death, and it's even more so now that we have a viral pandemic circulating. So this is important stuff. Thank you so much for having me on this show. And helping me get this information to the public.
Thank you, Essay, for your time, and thanks for your contribution in journalism with your poignant pieces and very important pieces on the city's website. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Folks, to read Essay's powerful piece on environmental justice as it relates to COVID-19 and other stories investigating the effects of coronavirus in New York City and our borough here in the Bronx, you can visit thecity.nyc. Also, follow Essay on Twitter at Essay Olumhense. We'll be right back.
It helps the community out.
Daniel Montalvo from the Claremont section is talking about completing his Census 2020 form as the city announced the response rate at just over 53%, a figure well below the national average in the 2010 count of 74%.
Brings other businesses,
helps provide food, shelter. With the proper number amount, you can get the right things in the area.
The census will determine, with the official count of how many people are here, will determine what level of representation we get in the Congress, how much federal aid we get, you name it, for mass transit, for education, for so many things we depend on, billions of dollars hanging in the balance.
The mayor launched a social media campaign to encourage the public to go to my2020census.gov to complete what amounts to a 10-minute questionnaire while providing assurances that the following questions have been removed.
Questions about immigration status, income, criminal history, taxes. You will not even be asked your Social Security number. It is fast, it is easy.
While the COVID-19 pandemic has pushed the deadline to receive completed forms from July 31st to October 31st, the city is looking to raise the numbers now, and Anthony Lugo says he understands why.
Me, myself, I haven't did the census yet, but I guess I got to get into it so that we can get what we need.
And so does Natasha Williams, who mailed hers out as soon as she received it.
Yeah, because then we won't get the funding that's needed for our community. So it's very important to do.
To find out about opportunities with the city to increase the response rate, you can go to nyc.gov/censusweek. For BronxNet, this is Arlene Makoko.
Welcome back. Generation Green is a youth-led intergenerational community of Black environmentalists who recently held a teach out here in our borough to discuss how calling the Bronx dirty is internalized environmental racism. Here to discuss more is Jaylin Ward of Generation Green. Jaylin, thank you so much for joining us today.
No problem. It's an honor.
Honor having you as well. Can you tell us more about Generation Green and your mission?
Yeah, so Generation Green was started by a couple colleagues and I. We all go to Howard University, but we were invited to a Green New Deal conference like a while back, and we connected with other HBCU students who are interested in environmental justice. And we realized that we were all in these white spaces, but we had a very specific message about connecting climate issues to like our racial experience in this country, because they're very much so related. So we started Generation Green to give a platform for young Black environmental leaders who want to make it clear that environmental racism is connected to climate change and that Black and Brown communities are being hit currently by climate change, and we're going to be on the front lines of this battle. So we're trying to make that message clear through media, teach outs, and anything that we can do to get that message out there.
Thank you for sharing that, Jaylin. And recently, Generation Green held a teach out defining what environmental racism looks like in the Bronx in particular, and what people should take into consideration when thinking, quote, the Bronx is dirty, right? Can you please tell us about this teach out and your recent educational post on your social media page surrounding this topic?
Yeah, so I grew up hearing like, oh, the Bronx is mad dirty, like just all the time. And I'm like, okay. You're not wrong, but there's a reason. There's a reason. I'm from Co-op City, and I was a Girl Scout, and I was just always doing environmental things like planting trees and cleaning up after Hurricane Sandy. So I've always done environmental things in Black spaces, but I never considered what the environment meant. And your environment is your immediate surroundings. So if the Bronx is dirty, that's an environmental justice issue that we need to confront, and we need to confront why. So I did some archival research, and I found out that this is a issue that has been persistent in this area since like the 1800s, and then exacerbated in the 1930s when they decided to do redlining to divide white communities from Black and Brown communities, and then by the 1970s, where we have the issue of burning down buildings for insurance money, we have fire departments pulling out of the Bronx. We have trash collection companies pulling out of the Bronx. We have all of our health and, quality of life resources pulling out of the area. And that's how we end up with this catastrophe of, particulate matter, exacerbating asthma. We have the construction of highways. We have, backed up trash collection. So that's how we end up with all of these environmental issues that impact our health, So the post on Instagram was just to plant the seed and get the conversation started and connect people to the history.
And it did, and it came at a timely moment where, we're facing COVID-19 and health injustices in our borough. And it's not a coincidence that the rates of COVID-19 are so high here. It has to do with environmental injustice. It has to do with environmental racism. So thank you for sharing that post. It was really, a conversation starter for people in our borough for sure. Jaylin, can you share what made you personally decide that you wanted to get into this environmental work, and also share the impact of the work of Black environmentalists?
Yeah, so before college, like I just thought the environment was like national parks and grass and birds and, things like that. And as a Girl Scout, they really enforce like, getting into nature. But I realized that your environment is your immediate surroundings, and that is the truth. So if your environment doesn't have grass and birds and trees, you're pretty much breathing in smog because you don't have a cyclical nature that is, extracting a lot of the pollutants and exchanging with nature, So that's what we need to have, a symbiotic environment. But if you don't have that, that's your environment. So realizing that made me feel responsible, because I can't see a problem and just like be like, oh, damn, that's sad. So that really inspired me. So transitioning my work as a Girl Scout and into something more adult-like was why I got involved with Generation Green. I also work with this program called Soul Track, which is a collective of environmentalists started by, his name's Tyree. He was one of the first Black people to almost summit to this mountain in Alaska. What is it called? It's at Alaska's National Park, but it's the highest mountain in North America. So he decided to share his joy for environmentalism with a lot of Black people in DC. So I got on board with that, and I also garden in DC to provide food for queer, trans, Black, and Indigenous people, and just students facing food insecurity. And all those things are little parts of our environment. We need to interact with it, we need to benefit from it, and we need to make a sustainable plan to continue this relationship. So that's how I got into it, just feeling responsible.
I love it. Holding space for the community and, welcoming people into these discussions. Like you said at the beginning, it's mostly, discussions happening in white spaces, but we need to open them up for our Black and Brown community as well. Since all of these injustices. Jaylin, I also wanted to ask you to please tell us about your podcast, Black and Breathless, and how you link environmental issues to the pandemic and other racial justice inequalities in communities of color through this podcast.
Yeah, so the podcast, Black and Breathless, it kind of plays off of the idea that, when he said, I can't breathe, like that was a big issue. It wasn't only because he's being suffocated, it's because like also your environment, he had asthma, like that was an underlying condition as well. So, and to be in New York City where those rates are higher, it's an environmental justice issue as well. So that was a wake up moment for many of my friends and I, and we realized that, oh, this is like police brutality and other systems of white supremacy are very much so connected to our environmental experience. So we decided, like, since we noticed that in conversation, we're like, yo, we should have a podcast. And that's kind of how it started. So we just tried to implement every facet of life, from spirituality to climate change, and just loop that in back into the message. And it's not about creating a space at the table with white people. It's kind of creating our own space to talk about the issues that matter to us and reconciling with that, a very safe space to just express the things you've gone through environmentally, and just reconciling with that, healing through that. And that's what your environment should do. So that's what we talk about. It's about everything. We talk about why California is burning, and then we loop it back around to E5 or somehow. It just, it's a conversation.
Where can people check it out, the podcast?
Yes, it's on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, SoundCloud, probably a couple other streaming services, but those are the top three. I like to listen to podcasts on Spotify. I think it's an immersing experience. But yeah, we're on all three of those.
Agreed. And folks, if you missed the name, it's Black and Breathless on Spotify and all the streaming platforms that Jaylin just noted. What do you believe that environmental justice would look and feel like in our communities, and how can we get there?
That's a very good question. And I think I started answering that with feeling responsible and thinking about what can I do first? How can I use my skills to accomplish this goal? So if you're great at cooking, then you should be like, oh, how can I make my culinary arts more sustainable? How can I feed people? How can I use that to respond to my environment? So it's not about getting up and protesting and doing rallies on climate change. It's a lot more than that for Black and Brown communities. It has a lot to do with poverty. It has a lot to do with education. So you just consider first, how can I use my skills to accomplish a morsel of this goal and share that experience with people? So it's about the personal accountability and then opening up to your family and friends and their friends and just building community on those things. Like I say, everyone has a role. We can't all be marching and protesting on climate change. Everybody has work, everybody has school. So it's important that we connect our skills to a very tangible goal.
Beautiful advice. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Stay connected with Generation Green and listen to the Black and Breathless podcast. You already gave us that info earlier, but just staying connected with y'all online. How can people?
Yes. So you can connect with us on Instagram. We are very responsive. We see y'all comments. We see everything. Our Instagram is @generation_green. And we have Twitter. We don't really use it, but connect with us on Instagram and hear us on the sound waves with our Black and Breathless podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and SoundCloud.
Thank you, Jaylin, for joining us today and for sharing more about Generation Green.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you so much, Sonyi.
Thank you. Folks, again, you can follow Generation Green on social media @generation_green on Instagram for updates, educational postings, and more. You can also visit their website, gen-green.org. That's all for our show today. Thank you for tuning into BXRx. I'm your host, Sonyi Lopez, wishing you and your family safety and wellness now and always.